I'd be lying if I said that we are like huge F-Zero Wipeout fans. Like we definitely looked at those games, but the main inspiration for it was like, what if we do something really stylized? Not like let's try to be like Wipeout, but what if we do something really stylized? But then like we explored like sort of different musical ideas, and this sort of like not too intense kind of like floaty liquid drum and bass jungle just made sense. And maybe it is sort of because that subconscious 90s, early 2000 culture seeped into us as people, you know what I mean? Not even like intentionally adopted into our work practice, but just like, I'm a rave scene kid, like, so of course it's there as like of course it makes sense. So yeah.
SIFTER.com.au.
Hello and welcome to Lightmap from SIFTER, our video game industry show. I'm Adam Christou. Today we're linking up with Icelandic game development team Ghosts and chatting with Joon Van Hove about the rush, thrill and vibes of their retro-futurist racing simulator, Phantom Spark. Let's dive right in.
Join the SIFTER community on Discord at sifter.com.au/Discord.
Sometimes a game hooks you immediately with its combination of aesthetics and razor-sharp gameplay. Phantom Spark, the latest game from Icelandic developers Ghosts, is one of those gems. It's a love letter to turn-of-the-century racing games and the neo-futuristic rave culture that inspired classics like WipEout. Phantom Spark feels like a hazy, nostalgic dream. It's challenging, it's precise, frustrating, and yet completely exhilarating. Joining me to talk all about it is game designer Joon Van Hove. Welcome to Lightmap.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you here. And I thought we might just jump right into the nitty-gritty. Why a racing game?
Good question. I think my coworker Torfi, who I'll be mentioning a lot because it really was his sort of inception, his idea, and a direct result of his prototyping. So our last game, Nuts, came out early 2021, and he was part-time on it for a big period. And so with basically his free time, he was just prototyping kind of into the void of like, what's a good way to control a car and what's interesting sort of secondary mechanics to that. And he went completely on both directions of like deep simulation with multiple tires and friction on each tire and suspension. And then he also went the other direction, like, what if just a ball, but we put a ship model on the ball, and slowly started learning that like, off-the-shelf physics engines are pretty limiting and like kind of force you into like, doing things in a specific way. But there's this sort of like more pure, what if we do all the physics calculations ourselves with this like really abstracted, but at the same time easy to understand version of physics. And that was like a whole year for him. I think he made like 10 different sort of Unity projects with different feeling race controllers. And the timing just worked out really well that I was rolling off of Nuts in the spring of 2021, and he just had all these prototypes, and we've been sharing an office for years before we even worked together. So I'd be his first and main play tester for that period, where he'd just be like, hey, try this out. And there's something like generally visceral or something, or intense about racing games that you can just feel if it's good or not. If it's like kind of, you apply an intention at, I don't know, however frames per second your brain works, and you see the result immediately, especially those early prototypes that barely had any graphics. They ran at, 500 FPS or whatever. So you're just like, oh my God, yes, like it feels like a roller coaster. And the thing that became Phantom Spark, it was called Glide Rush for a long time because it just felt like you're on this kind of abstracted bobsled roller coaster ride, super fast, lots of verticality, and it was really it really was not coming from a place of like, we are going to make a racing game because we love racing games, but it's more of like my friend who has been just learning about car physics almost as a hobby or as like an interest in his game design practice ended up with something that feels awesome, and we just have to make it now. Like the thing that really crystallized it was as soon as he put basically ghosts in, like you record the position every couple times per second, and then you replay a half transparent ship. None of that is in its initial form was technically very complicated. as soon as that was in, and a sort of history of like when you finish, it took 30 seconds or whatever. With millisecond accuracy, we started going back and forth and just passing the controller back and forth. It's like, this is great. Like one track would be 30 or 20 or 30 seconds long, but we would play it for an hour, even in its barest form, where it's just polygons with basic color and default lighting and everything. It's like there's nothing there to enjoy except the movement and the competition element. That was working when I joined the project almost. Like, he had that as like a core. And then, I guess my main contribution to it has just been, okay, how do we make that into a sim shipped on all consoles and Steam game that people actually want to play for longer and get into and have that experience, even if you're alone. Because like, this is already a tangent, but like I have this, I sometimes teach game design, and you can really tell that like games that have a local multiplayer aspect in a group setting have like an insane unfair advantage. Like, people think when they've made a 2-player local multiplayer game that it's the best game that's ever existed, because it gets the entire room of maybe 20 people super excited and hyped. It is an unfair advantage, and it's not one that you can recreate on the marketplace pretty easily, right? So like, you can think about, okay, can we convert this into online multiplayer? But the challenge we really wanted to take with this is like, it's also fun to do it alone if you set up this like some kind of dynamic challenging system that encourages you to do better.
And I think that's really interesting for me as well, because I mostly played this as a solo player experience. There was one night where my partner kind of sat down on the couch and watched me for a good 2 hours, sort of mind-bendingly lose my mind as I replayed levels over and over. And yeah, as a single player experience, I felt really drawn into it, particularly about how you described that feeling of rush, or the just moment to moment feeling of momentum and speed that has been captured here so well. And I'm almost kind of curious. I know you came on board what felt like that had already been achieved, but as you were sort of developing it and prototyping it into its final form, how did you work to ensure that feeling of momentum and speed, and I guess I'm almost going to call it like the flow state that the player gets into when they're really just zoned in on trying to perfect milliseconds of times. How did you tweak that and ensure that feeling stayed right the whole time?
Some of it is like general game feel, like polish, like making sure that there's sound effects and VFX to echo those moments, both like communicate that they happen. Like, for example, a very basic thing you learn early on is when you hit the sides, you will obviously lose a little bit of speed, but also you will get a speed penalty, just because otherwise you could abuse it, right? Like, if you need to do a sharp U-turn and there's no speed penalty, and there's also no damage to the car, what would happen is you would get like an angle adjustment for free, right? So we have to do something else to discourage crashing, and that means that like at a high level where you're trying to optimize for like milliseconds, you really need to know if you just clip the edge or not, and so that nudging that until it feels right, making sure our collider sizes are sort of slightly on the generous side maybe, but at the same time learnable from that information.
Yeah, and congratulations to nailing that, because it feels miserable to hit like anything in this game. Like, there is nothing more miserable than doing one of the big challenge end of world sort of levels, which go for like quite an intense amount of period compared to the very fast levels before them, and like having to lock in with such focus, and then you just whiff and hit a corner right at the end. It's a level of dispiriting sadness that I cannot quite express. Yet the desire to immediately reload and start again like overtakes it very quickly, which I think is a hard balance to achieve.
Yeah, what you said, like restart quickly was another thing that was like basically immediately became a design pillar. Like, we want this to be instant resets, because it's so sort of pure. All that matters is setting a better time. It would be so wasteful if we somehow locked you into, you have to finish. Like, you have to finish even though we know you're going to lose. The next 30 seconds is just going to be excruciatingly you losing the entire time. So the instant reset button was a must to have. And so, we built on top of that. Like it'd be disingenuous for me to not call out like Trackmania as like a very big inspiration, because they have a lot of those things as well, where they have an instant reset button. They have short tracks that you play many times, but at the same time, playing a new Trackmania track is often an experience of 2 hours, just the same track over and over again. So we got a lot of inspiration from that and aimed for that, while also really trying to make something that feels just different enough to make sense, right?
How did level design sort of go with this sort of thing? I'm super curious. Like the process of how you went about iterating levels.
It was mostly, again, my coworker Torfi. We built the tools for it kind of together, which very quickly also realized that creating like a set of modular pieces is a really good constraint to have, in the way that like constraints foster creativity sometimes. That really was, it's so tempting to just be like, okay, I'll just make like a spline generator, or, like a 3D curve generator. Those exist, like, you can buy them in the Unity asset store, and have that be the racetrack. And you'll have full freedom, right? You can go anywhere, you can have any angle, any width, but at the same time, that one, you immediately felt like everything kind of feels the same now because you're on this line. While a big thing with the modular pieces is you have to think about like transfers. We have only really like 4 different corner radii, I don't know, which means they're kind of like more learnable, and you build up way more sort of, what's the word? I don't know, not clairvoyance,
like muscle
but,
memory almost. Yeah.
Muscle memory and the ability to sort of project an intention even on a new track. Like, after you've played 20 tracks in our game and you played the 21st one, you'll do a pretty good job actually on your first attempt even. And a big part of that, I think, is because we constrain our level design to those, we call them track bits, but yeah, like modules. And then made a bunch of tools to like also do that like pretty fast, sort of like the placement point. If you put down a straight piece, you can just spam the straight piece button and it keeps building them. And then if you turn left, you can put straight pieces again. So we could iterate like pretty quickly on levels. But what we also learned was that if we want them to feel homogeneous, it's kind of better if they're made by, or at least finished by, the same person. So it was mostly Torfi and Joost, the 3D artist, who Joost dressed them up, and Torfi made the final line. But it was really, the tools we made were sort of similar to the game itself, where sort of like there was just a button where like, bam, I'm in the track, I'm racing. Because it's such a, we should talk about the snowball effect at some point, but like the thing that makes tracks feel good is that you have this like, if you hit the turn at the sort of intended ideal maximum speed, it can feel amazing. But that might only happen the 50th time that you race the track or something, right? Like you have to sort of optimize the start to enjoy the ending properly and things like that. So we had to make sure that you can just have an idea for a track, try it out, and then be like, okay, this is not the right corner radius. Like you can design a track that just like feels awful because it's constantly forcing you into the side. It's like, it's good if a track has like 1 or 2 sections where we call it bonking, where you bonk into the side. And then that's the thing you have to learn about that track mostly, other than what the line is. It's also like, when do I lift or when do I brake? But if that's too much, if that's like sort of tips over into like, that's mostly what you're doing in a track, it just feels awful. The point of the track design, I guess, is to like underline when you do something correctly in one section, to give you like maybe a reward section right after, and to do that, takes a lot of iteration, lots of I don't know, manually laying bricks in this game, done by the main, I call him game director, Torfi.
It's like the experience for me was really exciting. Sort of one, that idea of the snowball in a racing game, which, my experience with a lot of racing games has generally been the sort of go-karty sort of games that you sort of grew up with, like your Mario Karts and stuff. I played a little bit of like F-Zero and stuff, but for me, I always liked the very arcadey racing games, and just really found myself whenever I played a more sort of sim racing game or a very sort of time or lap focused precision racing game, that I just didn't really understand some of the fundamentals of what it was trying to teach me to do. And what I really love about Phantom Spark is, at some point, an hour or two into it, I did start getting that feeling of I can kind of pre-predict the angles and positions of upcoming turns, and it's helping me almost like understand the literacy of the language of these tracks. But even more, I'm starting to understand what a line means, or what it means to actually perfectly time your brakes as you turn into a real hairpin turn so that you can keep all that momentum. And I was really blown away by how this game gently teaches you some of those mechanics, both intuitively but also very deliberately through some of the trial levels. And I sort of wanted to talk to you about how you sort of worked out that approach through level design, and sort of how you built challenge throughout the game to essentially teach people how to play precision races, and to learn how to take advantage of that snowball effect, because you just can't get good times on some of these levels unless you start to understand and learn that technique in this format.
It's interesting. It's again, definitely, Torfi would maybe be able to speak more to it, but what I felt is that like it became very intuitive for him throughout the process. Like, we tried to sort of codify it. We tried to think about, this is what makes a good level, so every level should have this and this, or even like we went pretty deep in the rabbit hole of like drawing graphs in hope that the graph of, I don't know, speed versus turning or something, or how many times you lift in a race, that there would be some like secret formula of, okay, here's the 3 tracks that we love, right? And we want to kind of distill the formula of what makes them good. But it was kind of nothing there. It felt like a bit of a fool's errand to try to do that. So he went completely the other route again, and just like, I'm just going to bang my head against the level editor until good tracks come out, and then thereby learn it intuitively rather than learn it through some like, you know, astrology that we're creating with these charts. And yeah, through that also poured over, you know, like what's like the kind of challenge that's actually hard to fully learn. Like, for example, the grass in region 3 was the hardest terrain modifier to internalize. So that's why we put it in the end, you know, and sort of start sprinkling it in those first tracks, and then longer and longer sections, because they're really punishing if you're not committed to like learning to do well. Like, I think if we put one of those in the first tracks, people would hate it because it just like, you know, like it messes with your muscle memory. But then you get over that and it feels amazing. Like I actually hated region 3 for a long time, or like Arun's domain. Or not hated, but I was kind of just like, oh, really? Is this the best we can do with this like terrain settings? And then at some point I like saw the Matrix, and now it's my favorite. Like I can't get enough of optimizing those grass lines, because it's a difficulty modifier on top of the already normal problem of making lines. Another like non-trivial thing that became an important bit really early on is the size of the tracks, because you want lines, you want to think about lines, you also need to have mobility and or like variance on it, right? Like, it needs to matter. And it's again something we tried to figure out the science for, and then realized that like we can just do this intuitively, of like, because there's gravity, and gravity actually it's subtle, but it does affect you. So if you make like a kind of a banked turn or like a bowl shape, the correct line is, I'm sure there's scientific formula for it, but it's also like really just like viscerally, if you have your ghost of your previous run, okay, what if I'm a little bit higher? What if I'm a little bit lower? But then also you'll get to a point where the ghost that challenges you does something completely different. There's so much variance on those types of shapes, because the interaction of gravity, your turning angle, and the fact that your speed dictates your turning angle also, means that, the level design just becomes, okay, I have this section, you build out the next section, you try it a bunch of times, and make sure that variance exists, that there isn't just like one obvious clear solution that's the only thing that we have here. If that happens too much, you'd have boring tracks.
The way you talk about ghosts in particular, it's like, I think this is the first time I finally get what they're for properly, because, you know, you come across them in, you know, Mario Kart is the other example I'm going to use, but like, you know, there's time trial modes in lots of racing games, and you can race against lots of ghosts and AI ghosts in other games, but I don't think I've ever really honed into the craft of like, I really have to pay attention to this thing. I really have to see what it's doing and try to understand, and then basically retroactively remake what it's trying to do for myself. Otherwise, I'm never going to get past these challenges. And I thought that was such a fascinating way of taking like a well-used mechanic in racing games and sort of really emphasizing it in a way that for me, it transformed the entire experience of how I engage with ghosts now. And I think if I play other racing games, I'm going to really think very differently about how I can sort of optimize myself, which is something I've never thought about in this outside of just winning, really. I wanted, though, to talk a little bit about like you mentioned Rune before. One of the key parts of this game's narrative is the various domains that we have, which is sort of the different levels with their own aesthetics and feels, but each one is sort of run by a different character who sort of inhabits a ghost if you're playing the campaign. And I'm a bit curious about how that process came about, the desire to create people to step in and be the sort of personalities for the worlds, and then the process of how you all workshopped their style of, I suppose, coaching is one way to put it, of helping you improve and get better, or having like a rival or a friendly supporter to challenge you to get better at the game.
Yeah, that was definitely a process throughout those years of like figuring out like how much world building and storytelling do we want in there. Like a reference we kept saying is kind of like we want some amount of world building and narrative, but on the level of like Street Fighter, and not we had at some point in one of our design documents, once we start writing plot, we should turn around. Like, no, there's no plot, but there is world building, there's flavor, there's character. And also coming from this place of like, we want it to be a good single player game because that's how a lot of people enjoy this. You have to buy into something, I think, to care about online leaderboards. Like, online leaderboards are sort of an end state for a lot of games. But if you sort of shove them in people's face too early, they'll be like, okay, I'm number 3,250. Who cares? Like, I might be able to climb a little bit. But what we're doing is, while you're playing single player, you're already on the leaderboard. We just don't really shove it in your face, so that by the time you might be done with the challenge, or you start caring enough about your position and just improving your rank, you can switch between. So yeah, we needed to have something in the single player that kept it interesting. And for a while, we did the Trackmania thing where you have bronze, silver, and gold in Trackmania times. And in some versions of Trackmania, you can see the ghost that goes along with those times. But it just felt really cold and impersonal. It's like, not okay. That's, who is it that you're actually racing, or what does that mean? And we tried to do the world building in that direction, where it's like, oh, there's 3, I don't know, spiritual ranks or whatever. But that just felt so boring, and more like, what if there's a character that talks to you, both tutorializing a little bit, but also can support the world building and encourage you. And then another big thing that we developed over time was sort of, my first idea would have been to create some sort of survivor or savior narrative, where like you save the world by becoming the best racer. It's like Pokemon catch 'em all, or you're the hero of the story. And then Torfi pointed out, it's like, yeah, but like, you're not, though. Like, most people aren't going to be in the top 10 best racers in the world. And it'd be really interesting to try and tell that story. Like, what if we try to create in the world building and in those characters a narrative of like, just doing this is rewarding, it's fulfilling, it's fun, and getting better is the thing that matters, but not necessarily for like an end goal. Like, that needs to be there, it needs to be communicated clearly, but we really wanted to make a game that like people who aren't going to try to get gold medal and everything still get something out of it and still feel fulfilled by it. So that's where the first kind of character came from. And then we realized, okay, but like, as soon as you get, again, if you've committed, you've bought into the game, we can start messing with you a little bit. So the second character is like really antagonistic, and
I was going to say he's a bit of a neg. He's so
yeah,
negative.
Totally. And then the third character, Arun, is sort of like, okay, what do you have if it's like, supportive and it's about self, growth and whatever. And then the second character is like, no, it's about competition. Like, what's a third flavor that actually makes sense? And it's also kind of the flavor that we ended up having ultimately we find out on the development team who's the best racer, and it's very difficult to challenge that. For the record, it's Joost. It's our 3D artist. He is far and away the best of the team. And every time we like actually sit down and sort of commit to doing a session where you try to beat him, the next morning before I even get to the office, he'll be back on top, which was unbelievable. But it also means that kind of like you have to accept this reality of sort of like some people are better than others, and it just like doesn't matter because it's personal, and it's about what you took away from it or something. And then the sort of third character is a bit of trying to tell that part of the story.
Yeah, I love that as well. It's like definitely Fuinti, the first character, feels like a supportive nurturer that's like, come on, you can do this. But there's also a slight hint of like, you really should be able to do this. And then you just get full steamrolled by Zin, who, for me at least, made me have a rival relationship very quickly and was like, I have to beat this annoying ghost whenever I can. And then, getting to the third world, it was sort of just like, accept that you might not be very good. It's okay. What are we if not racing? And I sort of loved that sort of very sort of almost mindfulness sort of vibe that kicked in on that third world.
My favorite line of the second character is at some point he says, did Fuinti ask about me? Where it like completely undermines his character of being like a badass competitor. He's actually like super insecure and just wants to impress the character from the first region. Really, again, it's not super encoded in the writing or anything, but there's this one line that to me is like, if you catch that, it completely destroys his credibility. He's just like, did she ask about me?
The first time I saw that, I was like, that's perfect and fits this character to a T with his like ridiculous over the top pose, and just it just undercut him wonderfully. Just a real beautiful, subtle bit of writing.
I feel like I should give credit to the people who did those things. So like Simon Demaret was the character designer, and Halima Hassan wrote the dialogue for it. So I want to make sure this, that I don't accidentally take credit for any of that work. So it's really awesome to see that all come together over those years.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned them, because I feel like there was a team that all came together for one part of the game that I think is really undeniable, which is, it's a nebulous term, but the vibes of Phantom Spark, which, it feels like an undeniable love letter to an era of racing of the late 90s, a particular style of games that, have disappeared over time, but I think have this sort of nostalgic eternity that's happening to them currently on YouTube, whether or not it's their soundtracks bubbling up through algorithms, or, the every 5-year sort of revival of kind of breakbeat and rave music that sort of comes up. And I'm wondering how you all landed on that aesthetic and then started working on honing it in as well as you did, because this really feels like an artifact of that time, and a response to it as well.
It is in parts, but at the same time, I'd be lying if I said that we are like huge F-Zero WipEout fans. Like we definitely looked at those games, but the main inspiration for it was like, what if we do something really stylized? Not like let's try to be like WipEout, but what if we do something really stylized? But then like we explored like sort of different musical ideas, and this sort of like not too intense kind of like floaty liquid drum and bass jungle just made sense. And maybe it is sort of because that subconscious 90s, early 2000 culture seeped into us as people, you know what I mean? Not even like intentionally adopted into our work practice, but just like, I'm a rave scene kid, like, so of course it's there as like of course it makes sense. So but it is kind of funny to me how much people make the connection to those games, because it isn't really something we're set out to echo as strongly as I feel like it's being reported. But it doesn't bother me either. Like those are legends, and I'd love to be associated with them. How we got there, definitely, also through iteration, and again through direction as well. Like we worked with basically everybody on the team is people who haven't worked together before, except for me and Torfi. So a big part of it was just kind of exploration. Like we went through quite some cycles of different world building narrative ideas. The characters, fed into that. Like the character artist and the writer were sort of working at the same time and sending kind of ideas back and forth. All of it sort of filtered through mostly Torvi and maybe but all three of us, me, Torvi, and Joost. So for context, me, Torvi, and Joost were full-time for those 3 years. And the other people, which includes VFX, sound composition, music composition, writing, character artist, and some additional level design. I think that's everyone. There's a full list of credits on the website and in the game. Those people worked for somewhere between and a UI designer. Sorry, Nicola, I almost forgot. That those people worked for somewhere between 3 to 6 months. Some of them in a burst, some of them spread out over the length of the project. But yeah, luckily we had some time to iterate with all of them to make it harmonize with each other and not have it be, I don't know, feel kind of dissonant. But again, it's not a vibe that we set out to achieve, but at the same time, looking back, it does feel like we were kind of on a bit of a railroad without realizing. It's like, we think about sort of like, could we have ended up with a different game? And it's not easy to imagine how that could have happened because, it feels like it kind of had to be something like this. I don't think any of us would have been excited to make, I don't know, the version that's like more competitive or more sort of traditionally visually appealing. Joost Egermont is an amazing 3D artist, and pretty much all of the visuals are him creating a bunch of sketches in a bunch of different directions, and then us like filtering through. It's like, okay, we like this one and this one, and that's how we ended up there.
Yeah, I was going to say the 3D artwork in this is really marvelous, and it at times reminds me of like really like mid-90s late night TV commercials that were using like very early era 3D graphics. I think about that episode of The Simpsons where Homer goes to 3D World. I think about like old school rave flyers that were like kind of jumping into that sort of retro futurist kind of aesthetic. And I just, I sort of fell in love with the visual feel of like, turn of the century, basically. It was sort of like I'm playing a Y2K ultra precision, the world could end from like something going wrong on data code sort of video game. It just had a real special flow to it, which I think was, an amazing lightning in a bottle moment, I think, for the whole team.
Yeah, and some of that is definitely also just scope and constraints, where like I think we focused on, I don't know, texture, material, and making sure that the levels feel filled out, that they don't feel like empty, rather than, I don't know, poly count, or like the detail lies in the composition of track and environment more than the actual models, because also you fly by them at an breakneck speed, so it doesn't matter that there's too much detail in the actual I don't know, texturing or 3D models. But also the reality of having it run on the Switch, for example, necessitates that you can't go too deep into making it. But yeah, like all of the 3D art is made by one person, which I still think is incredible. Like after we started working with him, because we connected just because of this project, but both me and Torvi had been fans of Joost's work since a long time. It's like, oh man, maybe one day we can work with somebody like him. And then we actually contacted him, and he's like, oh yeah, I'm available actually. He's like, oh fuck, this rules. And after the first couple of months, we were like, this is wild, to the pace at which this man can create both the design and the execution. Unbelievable. So yeah, we chased that for the entirety of made sure that whatever we did was to enable him to perform his work as best as possible within the framework of the game. Very happy with where it ended up.
One thing I love to ask developers when they finally finish a game, because it is such a long-term project from start to finish, is how has it influenced what you want to do next? And have you even thought of where you might be going next after the experience of working on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, it ties into our last game. Nuts was very difficult to make in terms of It was way bigger than anything I had done before. I kind of didn't want to be the director of it, but became the director because I was the person who hired everybody else. I was kind of creatively exhausted after that. And then coming on board with this project, first of all, it's not my kind of brainchild entirely, or alone, it doesn't come from an idea I had, and now I have to like scramble to justify that for the next couple of years. So Phantom Spark was really appealing just because the design was just there, or the root, the core design, right? The core gameplay loop, like what is it? And then we could focus on all the secondary questions of like, what's the metagame? How do we make a single player campaign out of this? How do we present this information in a digestible way? Like the amount of iterations we did on this like ring that shows up on the end screen, and now I'm back at like, the last year hasn't been like particularly creative in a sort of game design sense for, I think for any of us, but definitely not for me, working on like leaderboards and UI and just, console compliance or whatever. So I'm kind of ready to do some game jamming and come up with something new, because we don't really have a next game in the bag. We're also not really a company in the sense that we have any obligation to keep working together. I'd work with anybody who's worked on this in a heartbeat, but if it makes sense for whatever project we were able to get off the ground somehow. So I'm probably just going to take some time and come up with something new. But I think I'm done making Phantom Spark for a while, unless there's enough demand for it, but I still love playing it. So there's a part of me is like, fuck, can I just take 6 months and make a track editor just so that for the rest of my life I can play new tracks made by myself or community members or something, because the tracks are made in Unity, so like we can't really distribute our tools to create tracks easily. But if we could, I could have that experience of discovering a track and doing this 2 hour long slow increment, which, I'm actually surprisingly still able to. I think there's enough tracks in there so that by the time you get to the end, you've forgotten some of the first ones. So I've 2 times already since the game's release played through the whole thing, and I'm excited to keep doing that for a long time. But yeah, what comes next? I think there's a lot left on the table with my previous game, Nuts, which was like a first person adventure mystery game that did have game mechanics. Like it wasn't quite the walking simulator, but it did some interesting things with like cameras and recording in-game stuff and then looking back at it, which has both existed before, and since then there's some interesting new games like the Crush House and what's the other one, the Landfall game, the Trigger Warning. I think all do some interesting things with like you're recording stuff that happens in the 3D simulated world. And so my plan is to play some of those, see if I get inspired and make some more prototypes, and maybe go back to making more art housey indie games. Of course, all depends on what I can get people to pay for.
Well, it sounds like a much deserved break after a lot of work. You can find out more about Phantom Spark on online. It's on Steam. It's on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 and Nintendo Switch as well. If you want to learn more about Joon, you can check out his blog and website at joon.be as well. Thank you so much for being on Lightmap.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're listening to Lightmap, interesting conversations with video game creators.
This has been Lightmap, SIFTER's interview podcast. SIFTER is produced by myself, Fiona Bartholomaeus, Courtney Smith, Carl Pauletto, and Chris Budden. Mitch Lowe is senior producer, and Gianni Di Giovanni is SIFTER's executive producer. Thanks to Audio Technica Australia and Apple for their support of SIFTER. Have you subscribed to SIFTER on YouTube? It's super easy to do. Just hit the subscribe button and make sure you turn on your notifications to get an alert when we release a video. You can get episodes of Lightmap, this podcast, our interview show, walk through our news show, and drop rate our reviews show in tasty video format. Head to youtube.com/SifterHQ to give us a follow. That address is youtube.com/SifterHQ. You can also rate us on Pocket Casts, which is actually my podcast player of choice. I use it on my phone right here. It rules. How about you hit us up with a 5-star review? And then why not? We'll catch you on the next episode of Lightmap. Until then, I'll see you on the racetrack.